Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the webinar, Illinois AT Guidance Manual, 2nd edition, Transition for Students Who Use AT and Additional Resources. Presenting this series, and this will be her third webinar, we have Gail Bowser with us this afternoon. Gail, we're very excited to have you back. So without further ado, I would like to welcome Gail back. Gail, thank you for joining us, and we are going to take a moment so I could pass the screen controls over to her at this time.
Hi, everybody. It's a pleasure to be back one more time. I'm starting to feel like I get a regular weekly visit to the state of Illinois right now. So thank you all for joining me. There we go. Welcome again. This is, as Sam said, the third in a series of 4 webinars that is covering the basic information in the new Illinois Assistive Technology Guidance Manual, the 2nd edition of that manual. I'm excited about today's content because this is a brand new chapter that has not been in the manual before, and it addresses transitions for students who use assistive technology. We're also going to go over the appendices and some of the resources that are included in the guide because they are also new, and we're excited to have them included. We wanted to make sure that you were aware of what was there. You all should have a PDF copy of the guide, but at some point today I'm going to move to looking at that directly on the screen so that you can see that resource section. I need to tell you that I am an independent consultant. I used to work for the state of Illinois as the state of Oregon as the Oregon Assistive Technology Specialist for the State Department of Education, which is part of the reason that Infinitec and ISBE contacted me to help with the writing of this guide. You see there also my email, and you are welcome to contact me with questions or concerns about the guide. We are just releasing this for the first time this month, so we're hoping to give you enough information and enough overview that you can take a look and give us feedback and help us understand what kinds of questions people still have after the guide's been written. I also need to say that the information in the 2nd edition of the Illinois AT Guidance Manual is provided as a support to districts in order to clarify procedural questions and describe effective AT practices. If your district has practices that are established and working, there's no implication in this guidance manual that should be interpreted to say that you need to change what you're doing unless the AT practices in your district don't provide the child with a free and appropriate public education in the least restrictive environment. So if you think things are working for your students and the families and other professionals that you work with think that your AT system is working well, we're excited for you, and we want to encourage you to go ahead and do the things that you've been doing well already. If you encounter questions about compliance and you find that they aren't addressed in the guide, we do suggest that you consult with an attorney because we know sometimes any special education process can become a little confrontational, and we want to make sure that families and staff have accurate information that they need. The first part of the presentation today, we're going to go over a few questions that we got after last week's session that we felt needed some clarification right away today. So one person on the webinar last week asked me, as I was talking about assistive technology services, what is meant by AT services? That's information that is included in IDEA. You'll see the quote on this page is direct wording out of IDEA law. And I spend a lot of time with this definition, so I just assume everybody in the world knows what it says too. Thank you for pointing out that I had kind of jumped ahead a little bit in terms of providing information. So I want to just briefly go over the definition of assistive technology services that's listed here. The main thing, I think, is that first sentence. Assistive technology service means any service that directly assists a child with a disability in the selection, acquisition, and use of an assistive technology device. So anything that you need to do in order to make sure that you've taken a good look at the student's needs and done good high quality consideration, as we talked about last week, can be considered an assistive technology service. IDEA lists these services specifically. So the evaluation of a need of a child with a disability, including functional evaluation of the child in the child's customary environment. So you may remember that last week we talked about evaluation and assessment, but also we talked about trial periods of equipment, which could be either part of assessment or evaluation. So that meets the need that's listed here in IDEA. The second service that's specifically listed as a responsibility of school districts for children who need assistive technology is purchasing, leasing, or otherwise providing for the acquisition of AT devices. So making sure that the child has the assistive technology that they need. And we talked some about the school district's responsibility to provide AT, but also their ability to look for outside funding sources if those are available. C is selecting, designing, fitting, customizing, adapting, applying. I think it's like a word salad here. Making sure that the child has the assistive technology that they need, and then repairing or replacing it if that becomes necessary. D is coordinating services with other therapies to make sure that all the people who might be involved in assistive technology have the ability to know what's going on with the assistive technology and can collaborate and interact. You know, one of the things that always strikes me when I read this particular service in IDEA is that assistive technology is one of the few services we provide which doesn't actually belong to a particular discipline. So an educator might be thinking about a child's need for assistive technology. A speech and language clinician might be thinking about a child's need for assistive technology. OTs or PTs might be thinking about that same child or a different child and their need for assistive technology. And all of that thought and consideration really depends on the characteristics and the needs of the individual child. I think it's one of the reasons why we have needed a guidance manual about assistive technology, and also why it can sometimes feel a little bit confusing because there's no specific discipline that owns the field of assistive technology. We're all involved as we should be. The last two bullets are about training or technical assistance, both for the child or that child's family, and also for the professionals providing the education or rehabilitation services. And you see, again, there's another list of people who might need training. So that's the definition in IDEA about assistive technology services. There were a couple other questions I want to get to before we talk about transition today. And one of the reasons I wanted to talk about this group of questions is that some of the questions that we received were really beyond the ability of ISBE to give guidance. So let's look at the three bullets on the right. Does a formal report have to be written for an assessment, or is data that's gathered enough? That's really a question for your school district and your school district processes. Each public agency has the right and the ability to create operating guidelines and processes that help everybody in the district to offer consistent, equitable, and effective assistive technology services. So this question about who writes a report, when does a report have to be written, or is data enough, really is a question that has to be addressed at the school district or agency level. And the reason for that is that every school district and every agency will have different resources, different geography, different staff available. They'll have many, many differences in what's available to them. So you can imagine that assistive technology services, for instance, in Chicago Public Schools might be quite different than the assistive technology services that are provided in Decatur. For that reason, ISBE doesn't offer guidance at that kind of a detailed level, and we expect that school districts will give that kind of guidance to their staff just as they give guidance to staff about how to do other special education processes and district processes. One of the other questions we got that's of a similar nature is someone said, we have a student who only played on the AT device we provided, and the AT was discontinued. When I hear played on, I always assume that was an iPad, but I don't have that specific information. The person who submitted the question said there was no other intervention suggested or recommended. Is it up to the teacher to come up with ideas? Again, the answer to that question is that that needs to be a district process and a district decision. But certainly in this case, where you tried one kind of assistive technology and it didn't work well for the student, it would be up to the IEP team to reconsider whether or not this student really could benefit from assistive technology, or whether there are other instructional strategies or accommodations or modifications that might offer the student the desired benefit. A third question here that falls in this category of needing to be district guidance rather than ISBE guidance. If during a classroom assessment, a person coordinating an assessment activities is not a member of the student's team, do you get parent permission for that person's participation? That question really depends on a whole lot of things. It depends on whether or not the additional person is an actual member of the staff of the school district. It might depend on all kinds of things. But basically, that is a district policy question, and it probably applies to many situations in addition to the question about assistive technology, because I'll bet you often have consultants who come in to help with an individual child's IEP or educational program, and there are things that you have to do to make sure that the parents are informed about what's going on, and also make sure that you're in compliance with a free and appropriate public education and purpose. So I wanted to say that there are some questions we just won't be able to answer because they need to be answered at a different level. Here's two more questions that we found that we couldn't answer for a different reason. These kinds of questions really depend on what the data about an individual student that was collected during classroom assessment or evaluation has to offer. One of the questions was, when does consideration require an evaluation versus when does consideration require a classroom assessment? How do teams know when they need to move to an evaluation? The second one that's similar to this is, if a team doesn't have enough information during the consideration conversation, can we use assessment instead of an AT evaluation if the domain area is already identified? Again, the answers here are not even probably district policy, although I'd certainly be talking to my district director of special education if I had a question like this. But these are really questions where the IEP team needs to sit together or meet together somehow and say, what do we think? Do we have enough information about this child? Is their performance in receptive and expressive language to just try some classroom assessment strategies and try some devices, or do we need an evaluation? So ISBE does not have criteria for decisions that are really the responsibility of the IEP team. And one of the things I really have learned over time is that it's a big responsibility that IDEA puts onto IEP teams. They're really required to understand their own responsibilities and make decisions about the lives of individual children. So that can sometimes be scary. You probably won't get state guidance about decisions like this. You may not get school district guidance about decisions like this. But one thing I do want to say is if you have questions about what's needed for an individual child, it's always good to see if you can identify some of the people in your district or in your resource group who might be able to have some additional ideas about how to operate. Since we're doing an Infinitec webinar today, let me say that Infinitec is a great resource for individual information about some situations like this. So you might want to start with some of the folks at Infinitec and see if they have ideas to offer you when you have questions like this. We had a question that we addressed last time that actually had a follow-up question. So I wanted to go over that with you. And then we're going to move on to transition so that we have enough time to do that. This question said, if the team decides during the consideration portion of the meeting to complete an evaluation, is it appropriate to indicate that in the consideration of special factors box? And we last time gave this example wording that's on the left side of your screen. The team has determined that an AT evaluation is necessary to establish whether AT would benefit the student. The team will use the IEP evaluation process and update AT information throughout the IEP within 60 school days. So we had quite an extensive conversation about this idea of postponing, that's probably not even a very good word, about delaying the decision about a specific assistive technology solution in a specific domain by starting an evaluation process. And if you want more information about that specifically, I want to refer you back to last week's webinar. But we did have a follow-up question that we thought was important to address. And that was, do we have to hold another IEP meeting, or could this decision, once it's made and once the evaluation is completed, be changed with a minor amendment form? I did talk to ISBE about this because every state has different rules about how the forms are used and when they're used. And the response I got from our ISBE representative was, because the IEP team has already determined that the student needs AT, an amendment form could be used. However, if a member, and I want to say if any member of the IEP team disagrees with the evaluation results, that person could request another IEP meeting and begin a discussion or a new consideration process based on the results of the evaluation. So those were some of the questions that we got last time. We'll come back to some other ones after our content. I did want to say today's topic is Chapter 9, Understanding AT Services in the Context of Transition. We're also going to look at additional resources in the guide. There's going to be one more webinar. Our webinar next week is the final one in this series. And it's going to be about some of those things that I just discussed in terms of having district guidelines and operating procedures for teams to help them know what it is they need to do and when they need to do it. To help us prepare for the final webinar, please go ahead and type your questions and concerns into the questions panel. And if we can't address them today, we'll do so at a later date. So Sam, do we have any questions right now?
I would say two questions that I see that would be fairly pertinent popping up. The first one, Gail, is if parent permission is obtained for a classroom assessment by a non-regular member of the student's team, does this initiate the 60-day clock?
If it is a district form, then absolutely yes. I'm a little unclear what that situation would be. So I'm not sure if you're talking about an outside evaluator or somebody who's actually been brought in to be a part of the IEP team process.
Linda, clarify that real quickly.
In general, I would say yes. When a district level form is used to start an evaluation process and permission to evaluate, all the timelines and all the rules apply.
A cooperative consultant brought in to support the teachers. So yes, someone from their special education cooperative.
Okay, if it is part of the IEP consideration process, then yes. Any evaluation that started and parent permission is signed, the timelines and the rules for evaluation apply.
Okay, and then the one additional question we will take at this time, it's a quick one. Does AT technically include, when we were talking about the services definition and the definitions of AT, would that technically include internet access, really looking from the perspective of today's e-learning situation?
You know, that's a question that's popping up all over the place. Assistive technology can include internet access if it has a direct relationship to the child receiving a free and appropriate public education and accomplishing goals on the IEP. So I don't see any reason why assistive technology could not include internet access, but it wouldn't just be the internet access, because what we need to demonstrate is that the child will be able to do something that is difficult or impossible because of their disability. So it wouldn't just be, I want my child to have internet access, but there has to be a direct relationship to goals and overcoming barriers.
Okay, we'll pause for questions at this time, and then I'll wait for you when you're ready, Gail.
Okay. I got to tell you, I'm excited about being able to introduce you to this transition chapter, because transition has been one of my passions in terms of transition for people who use assistive technology. Early on in my career, I was working with several high school students who worked in my program as supported employees. They did data entry and were hired as clerical staff. And they all had used assistive technology in their elementary, middle, and high school programs. And they were working for me using that same assistive technology in order to do computer data entry, to talk to people in the agency. All three of these folks were adults who needed powered wheelchairs, who needed alternative computer access, needed augmentative communication devices. So they were pretty severely impacted by their disabilities, but they were also quite bright and were able to work at my education service district in my program as paid employees. They could operate Excel spreadsheets and create word processing documents and do all kinds of pretty traditional office tasks. So one of the things that resulted from that was that I was really interested in what it took to help people who use assistive technology at the high school level to move forward into adult life and continue to use that assistive technology. Because frankly, if we don't do some advanced planning, and I really mean way advanced planning, like beginning from the day we help students to try out new assistive technology, if we don't plan for those kinds of transitions, what can happen is that the technology gets abandoned when things change radically. So in the context of Chapter 9, what we've done is collect a lot of the information and research about transitions for assistive technology users and try and give people in the field some ideas about the things that are important to think about. There are also a lot of questions about transition which arise when students move from one educational environment to the other. So we tried to address those too. This is a chapter that was very much guided by people in the field and the focus groups that Dr. Brian Wojcik helped to hold in the time before we developed this guide. And there was a lot of emphasis on the need for something about transition. So the chapter itself addresses these 4 bullet points. High quality assistive technology transition planning, so including assistive technology in any transition plans that you make for students. There's also some wording in the guide about device acquisition and transfer. Some wording about the need for planning for AT services during transition. And then a focus on student training and skill acquisition in order to prepare for and be successful in transitions where the student is taking assistive technology with them. I want to give you the wording that's in IDEA about transition planning. Now, I do want to say that there is no specific wording in IDEA about planning for transitions for people who use assistive technology. So the words that you'll see on this slide are the words that come from the definitions of transition planning and the transition sections of IDEA, but you won't see the words assistive technology on this slide. So IDEA Part B defines the term transition services as a coordinated set of activities for a child with a disability that's designed to be results-oriented and focused on improving the academic and functional achievement of the child with a disability to facilitate the child's movement from school to post-school activities. So when we talk about transition here, we're really talking about the move from school services to community services. That's what IDEA is able to talk about. It might be that you're talking about a move to post-secondary education, to vocational education, to integrated employment, like the situation I described to, or some other employment situation. It might be any kind of a move, and it might also address independent living and community participation. So all of these words are in IDEA, that whole list of things that you might be helping a student make a transition in these areas. Transition planning is based on the individual child's needs, taking into account the child's strengths, preferences, and interests. There's a real focus in the transition wording that's in IDEA about strengths, preferences, and interests, because we are asking in the school to community transition for our students to become more like adults. And so we want to know what their preferences and interests are. Transition planning could include, as the third bullet indicates, instruction, related services, community experiences, the development of employment and other post-school adult living objectives, and if appropriate, acquisition of daily living skills and functional vocational environments. So that's a lot of stuff included in one small section of IDEA, and it talks about transition planning. But what I want to say is that any one of those bullets could include, in the planning activities, planning for assistive technology included in the transition. And what we discovered in the late 1990s was that many of the transition plans that were being made didn't address assistive technology because the wording wasn't right there in the law. So people who had students who effectively used assistive technology were forgetting to plan for those transitions when they were planning for other parts of the transition. When we talk about transitions for assistive technology, we are talking about that school to community post-school transition, but we also can be talking about other transitions. Transitions from elementary school to middle school, or from middle school to high school. Transitions from one school to another. One of the big areas that I have a fair amount of experience with is transition for students who use assistive technology, but their families are migrants. They may be working in different parts of the state at different times because of what crops are coming in. So those kinds of transitions also need some planning, and they actually need more frequent planning because they happen more frequently. So in this chapter 9, what I wanted to say was that we're talking about the big T, transition from school to community, but we're also talking about those little transitions that happen more frequently. Some of the things that need to be addressed during a transition are things like this. Transition planning for AT may include training provided by the previous placement to the receiving placement. So if I have a student in my high school program and he's moving on to a work placement where he's going to need his augmentative communication device in order to help him remember what to do and communicate about what's happening, then I may be providing some training about how he does things and how the device works to the new environment. There are also questions about transfer of AT equipment from one placement to another and a purchase of new equipment. So those are things that are addressed in good transition planning. Also, and one of the things that we found in some of the research we did is that a thing that people can forget about is the identification and planning for specific AT services to the student that the student may need in the new receiving environment. As we did our research through Oregon Health Sciences University a few years ago, one of the stories that we ran across was a young woman who was an adult living on her own with personal care assistants who came in to help her with many of her daily functions, but at nighttime she was able to stay by herself and be independent. She used an augmentative communication device. And one of the things that one of the caregivers identified was that she still had the names of all her high school teachers on her communication device, but none of the names of the caregivers who were coming in to help her every day, because there had been no planning to make sure that she had help with her augmentative communication device and speech and language clinician services to help her change her vocabulary when she needed to. So that lack of service really translated to a lack of planning, and it taught us a lot about what kinds of things we need to be thinking about when we think about any transition. Other questions that are addressed in the guide. Device acquisition and transfer is always a big question, and it's kind of the place to go first because it makes sense to go there first. This student has a high-tech augmentative communication device. They're moving on to a new environment. It's a school purchased device. So what happens to that device? One of the questions addressed in the guide is, can a student take school-provided AT to a new placement? I want you to look at the response in the guide because there's a lot of it depends kinds of answers here. If the school purchased an assistive technology device, the device belongs to the school or the district. So if the student is moving from one school to another within the district, then that transition is usually pretty easy. But if the student is moving from school to community or moving to another district, that may be more complicated, and it will have implications for both the sending district and the receiving district. So I'm going to encourage you to take a look at page 46 in the guide and see what we said there about that issue. Another question that's addressed in that same part of the guide is, can AT be transferred to a student upon graduation or to another placement to which the student is transitioning. Again, that's one of those questions that we discuss in the guide, but the real answer is that is a district policy. There is no official legal guidance in the state of Illinois about transfer of equipment, except that it's allowable. So a district might be willing to sell the equipment to the receiving environment, sell the equipment to the student, might be willing to do all kinds of things, even more generous things than that. But it really is a district level policy about what happens to equipment when a student makes a transition. It's one reason, I think we talked a little bit last time, it's one reason why a student having their own device, if it's a specialized device and specialized equipment, can really be a good idea and a benefit, particularly as students get older and more capable in using their assistive technology. In this chapter, we also talk about student training and skill acquisition. And we used a paradigm from Janice Light, who talks about the 4 areas of competence for augmentative communication devices. This paradigm we've modified so that it applies to all kinds of assistive technology devices. And we talk about the fact that there are really 4 kinds of skills that students need in order to be capable and really functional and independent with their assistive technology. So one of those kinds of skills is operational skills. Of course, you need to know how to make the thing work, the assistive technology device. For some devices, that's very simple. You just pick it up and use it if it's a special spoon or a pencil grip. For other devices, like a Chromebook with all kinds of speak aloud extensions and things like that, it's going to be a more complicated process. But the student has to have the skills to operate the device. And then the second thing, they have to have the skills that address the function for which we chose the assistive technology. So if we chose assistive technology for writing, then the student has to know how to create a good sentence and how to punctuate and start with a capital letter, things like that. If we chose the device as a communication tool, the student needs to know how to have a conversation with people, not just how to make the words come out of the device, but how to have a conversation, how to take turns, things like that. There are also social skills and self-determination skills that are addressed in the guide, how to use devices around other people, and how to explain to other people what this device does for you and why you use it. And then finally, the 4th category that's addressed in the guide is strategic skills, knowing when to use assistive technology devices and when to use some other strategy, like asking for help, and also how to choose the devices in your tool set to identify the one that's most effective and best for the task that you're trying to do right now. So that's some information that I hope catches your attention and really gets you to want to look at the transition chapter in the guide. Sam, this is probably a good time to stop and say, are there any questions about anything that we talked about in terms of transition?
Yes, we'll take 2 more. We'll address 2 more at this time. The first one is, in our co-op, vocational job placements refuse to allow AAC devices into the work fields due to liability. Wouldn't this be illegal or in violation of FAPE?
Anytime somebody says, would this be illegal, I want to defer to ISBE. So let me take that question back to ISBE and we'll bring it back next Monday with some kind of a response. One thing I will say is if the student has work experience goals that include use of an augmentative or an assistive technology device in their IEP, it's the district's responsibility to implement that IEP. But we're talking about multiple agencies here and actually multiple laws involved. So let me go back and check with ISBE and I'll bring that one back.
Okay, sounds good. And the second question is, when a student turns 22 and no longer receives services from the district, Who would provide AT services in the adult world? And if we are planning for it in the transition plan, how do we handle the cost for such services?
Who will provide the devices in the adult world will be very much up to the characteristics of the individual and the services that they are eligible for. Common agencies that can provide assistive technology to adults are your developmental disabilities agencies and your vocational rehabilitation agencies, depending on what the child uses and what they're eligible for. But there are a million ways that people acquire assistive technology devices as adults. Sometimes that they buy them themselves, sometimes it's insurance. What's clear is that once a student leaves the school system, it is not the school system who's responsible for the provision of the assistive technology. And can you repeat the second half of that question for me?
Then the second half of the question was, if we're planning for it in a transition plan, how do we handle the cost for such services?
So if you're planning for a transition plan from school to community services, that's one of the things that really needs to be addressed, is who will pay for that device and how will it be acquired. And then also don't forget to plan for the provision of and the cost for any services that will be needed in order to make sure the student or the person is still able to use their assistive technology as an adult. One of the things that we see as students move from school environments to community environments is that they abandon their technology because they don't have all of these 4 skill areas and they aren't able to be independent. The school has done a lot of supporting of the assistive technology use. But by the time a student leaves K-12 system and moves on to community services, whatever they are, they should be pretty independent with their assistive technology, or there should be a plan in place to make sure that they continue to receive the training they need in order to become independent.
We had someone else also ask, to kind of piggyback off of that, wouldn't access to AT in the workplace also fall under ADA?
Yes, it's one of the reasons I hedged a little bit on that previous question, because there are a number of other laws besides IDEA that apply when you're talking about an adult service agency, and I want to get my ducks in a row before I give a full answer to that question. So we will address it next time.
Okay, perfect.
I did want to spend just a minute showing you some of the resources that are in the appendices for the guide, because we're very excited to have been able to include all of these items at the end of the guide. You have in the guide the full set of indicators, of the quality indicators for assistive technology services, the quiet indicators. And they are listed with the indicator, the intent statement, sort of a clarification of what each indicator means, and also some common errors that school districts make when they're providing assistive technology services. The indicators themselves there are 8 areas. They are consideration, evaluation, inclusion in the IEP, implementation, evaluation of effectiveness, transition, administrative support, and professional development. So the indicators really cover a wide range of activities that we've talked about in the guide in terms of Illinois law specifically, but we wanted to be able to give you those indicators to help you get a picture of what high quality assistive technology services might look like. So the indicators describe high quality assistive technology services regardless of what your service model is. If you have an expert model where you have a team of people who goes in and works directly with individual students to identify the assistive technology they need and help make sure it gets into a classroom. We believe those indicators will apply to your model, but also if you have a more capacity building model of service where you're encouraging your resource room teachers or teachers in your self-contained classrooms to begin to make some of those assistive technology judgments on their own, these indicator areas should also apply to your model. There's a new inclusion in the quality indicators for assistive technology family, and that is quality indicators for students with Section 504 plans. We know that there are many students in our public schools who do not need specially designed instruction or IEPs under IDEA, but they may also need assistive technology in order to benefit from their educational program. These are often students who have academic difficulties caused by their disability. A common one of the most common areas is written communication. So you may see students who require some kind of electronic keyboarding option or speech to text in order to participate in the general curriculum. But students under Section 504, while they benefit from the general education curriculum, may need assistive technology to help them overcome barriers posed by their disabilities. So there are quality indicators for those students which relate to the quality indicators for assistive technology, but are a little bit different because there is no IEP for students like that. Also in the guide are 4 forms. There is the SET scaffold, which Joy Zabala generously shared with us, which helps us to make decisions about what of a variety of tools might be the most useful and beneficial for an individual student as the team considers assistive technology. There is a sample assistive technology implementation plan, which was originally developed by the SEAT Center and has been modified a little bit for this guide. There's a sample agreement between parents and a district when parents have purchased the student's assistive technology and it's going to school to be included in the educational program. And then finally, there is a transition planning worksheet that relates directly to the chapter that we discussed today, and it is a tool that was developed by the Quality Indicators for Assistive Technology Consortium. I'm going to get out of this PowerPoint right now, and I realize that we're going to lose the captioning when we do that, so I apologize for that. I didn't think about it until just this minute. But I did want you to see that this is the appendices at the end of the guide. There's the quiet indicators, and there's a lot of them. There's 8 areas, and they're all 2 or 3 pages long. There's also Quiet 504 indicators, and so you'll see those here. But what I'm really trying to scroll down to, don't get dizzy here, is the forms that we provided. Because, okay, so here's the Quiet 504 indicators, and they have 7 areas, which includes student instruction about assistive technology. That's one that isn't included in the regular IEP indicators. And then finally, here is the SET scaffold form that Joy Zabala has shared with us. And there's the second page of that. Here's the assistive technology implementation planning form, which is a tool that can be used by teams after they've determined the student's need for assistive technology. Then the sample agreement letter. This was actually developed by a school district attorney, but if you're going to use a form like this, I really suggest that you get your district attorney to take a look at it and make sure it says what you want it to say and that it is legal. And then finally, the Quiet Transition Planning Worksheet for assistive technology users, which can also be found on the Quiet website as a Word document. Sam, I think I'm done for the day. We've got a couple more minutes. Do you have any more questions for me?
Yes, we'll take 3 more questions at this time. The first is in reference to some of the supports that you just shared, Gail. Is there documentation in the manual that supports school teams who identify a need for AT, but the parents refuse?
Again, I need to check specifically, so we'll put that on the list for next time. But I think that the processes that would apply are really the processes that apply anytime a school team makes a recommendation and the parents refuse. So you have processes in place for that event, I'm pretty sure, because it does happen reasonably frequently. And you would use the same processes, not special assistive technology processes in that area. But we're going to put that on the list for next time also. So we'll get back to you and see if we have any more clarification.
Okay, perfect. For our next question, we're going back to looking back at that IEP paperwork and checking yes or no in regards to, does the student need assistive technology? And this is kind of a scenario, so I'll go ahead and read it. And Erin, if I'm taking pieces incorrectly, please let me know. If the IEP team recommends AT assessment during the IEP, we typically check the no box and then write the educational team will request an assessment with the assistive technology specialist to determine if there are additional tools needed in the educational area that would allow FAPE. Is that correct in going forth?
Sure.
Okay, and then
oh, more?
I was going to say yes, there's a second part. And looking that the yes is checked should only be checked if AT is needed following the assessment.
Well, that's correct.
Okay.
There are a couple ways you can do that, and we've, I think, provided information about both of them in previous webinars, but we'll clarify next time. You could do 2 things. You could say, yes, we believe assistive technology is needed, but we don't have the specific assistive technology identified yet. We're not sure if it's an electronic augmented communication device or a pod book or a PEX system. So we're not sure what will work, but we're pretty sure the student needs augmented communication. So that would be when you check yes. And then you could say, and we're going to go back and do classroom assessment and determine how we're going to approach this need, but again, in the next 60 days. If you say no, then you almost are going to have to open a domain and call it an evaluation, because what you've done is identified an area where you don't have enough information and you need to collect more. So it would have to be related to a domain. I'm guessing it's communication, because that's where these questions come up the most often. So you could do it several different ways depending on how unsure you are about the need for assistive technology. And of course, the best thing would be to anticipate the conversation and collect some assessment data before the IEP meeting, because we now are informing parents at every IEP meeting that assistive technology will be considered. So we need to be prepared to do that when the meeting happens.
Okay.
I think that's all I have to say about that right now.
Nope, I think that's perfect because I got a good confirmation. That was how it was understood by the participant that asked. So thank you.
Okay. I do want to say there are a few more questions on this PowerPoint that we didn't get to today because you had such interesting questions. So we'll pull those up next time and discuss them in a little bit more detail. But if you've got the PowerPoint, you can look at the answers right now.
Perfect. Did you have time for one final question, Gail?
I do as you do. You're the one in charge of the webinar, so.
Okay, we'll do one more final question and then we'll wrap things up. So the final question is, do you recommend articulating concerns for the receiving team's need to get additional support and training for ATs by incoming students, for those students that are really moving from grade to grade? I'm really looking at the idea that sometimes those educational teams are not identified until like right before that week before school starts.
That's one of those questions that's going to depend on the student and the situation and all the players involved. So I don't have a general recommendation about that other than if the student or the receiving team members need more information about the assistive technology, the team should discuss ways that might be able to happen, or at least develop a communication strategy for communicating with the receiving school once the team is identified.
Okay, so that sums it up, Gail. Did you have any additional final comments that you wanted to share?
I want to thank you all for your questions. You're keeping me on my toes. I have to think really hard when we open this up for questions. And they're good questions that we will be sharing in different formats as we move forward after the webinar series is over. So thank you.
So thank you so much for sharing another hour of your expertise with us, Gail. So thank all of you, and this will conclude our webinar. Have a good night.
Good night, everybody.